That night, the elegant restaurant was filled with laughter, crystal glasses, and arrogance. A wealthy man, amused by his own pride, offered a cruel bet. "I'll give you $1,000 if you serve me in English." But what he didn't know was that the young waitress he tried to humiliate carried something far more valuable than money dignity. And when she finally opened her mouth to speak, every person in that room went silent. Before we begin, I just want to wish you peace, kindness, and moments that warm your heart. Tell me, my friend, from which country are you listening to this story? And what time is it where you are right now? Elliot Vance measured his worth in numbers, profits, stock prices, the clean arithmetic of success. To him, life had always been a balance sheet where emotions were liabilities best avoided. Outside his office window, Seattle lay under a sheet of fog, the kind that blurred the horizon until the sky and the sea looked the same. Inside, everything was sharp, polished, and under control just the way he liked it. The clock ticked toward 8 as he straightened his tie and reviewed the morning's reports. Each page a reminder that nothing in his world happened by chance. "Mr. Vance, your car's ready," Claire said softly from the doorway. She was young, precise, and careful with her words. Everyone at Vance Group had learned to be. Elliot nodded without looking up. "Good. I don't want to waste daylight." He gathered his documents, slid them into a briefcase, and brushed away a speck of dust that wasn't really there. Down in the lobby, a porter greeted him with a polite, "Morning, sir." Elliot responded with the same mechanical courtesy he used on investors. The man smiled too wide, the kind of cheer that irritated him. Outside, the drizzle had started thin and persistent. He stepped into the back seat of his black sedan, the city lights reflecting on the wet streets like shards of glass. He was traveling to Astoria, Oregon, for a new resort project, a coastal property the board was eager to acquire. To Elliot, it was another transaction, another piece on the chessboard of his empire. But as the car joined the interstate, a silence settled over him that the hum of the engine couldn't fill. He reached into his briefcase for his notes, and something slipped out a photograph, old and bent at the corners. He froze. The picture showed a woman standing near a pier, the sea wind tangling her dark hair. Clara. She was smiling at someone outside the frame, holding a paper cup of coffee, sunlight in her eyes. He hadn't seen that image in over 30 years. It must have been tucked in the folder by accident, or maybe fate had a cruel sense of humor. Elliot turned the photo over. On the back, faded ink read, "Astoria, 1991. The car jolted over a bump, breaking the spell. He placed the photo back inside, snapping the briefcase shut as if it could lock the memory away. Claire glanced at him from the passenger seat, her reflection flickering on the window glass. "Sir, have you ever been to Astoria before?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Elliot's eyes stayed on the road ahead. "No," he said simply. "Never needed to." And the highway curved along the coastline, where the ocean appeared in glimpses between cliffs and fog. He watched waves collide with the rocks below, white foam dissolving into gray water. Something about the rhythm, the endless push and pull, made him uneasy. He loosened his tie and tried to focus on the future, on deals, on anything but the woman in that picture. Hours later, the car stopped at a rest area overlooking the sea. Claire handed him a cup of coffee. "Careful, it's hot," she said. Elliot nodded, took a sip, and stared at the horizon. The drizzle had turned into rain, soft and steady, whispering against the car roof. He didn't notice how long he sat there, watching the water blend with the mist until it looked almost peaceful. Then, almost unconsciously, he murmured under his breath, "Why does this place feel familiar?" The words hung in the air, fragile as breath on glass. Claire looked at him but said nothing. For a man who never believed in ghosts, Elliot Vance suddenly felt surrounded by them, not the kind that haunt houses, but the kind that live quietly in memory, waiting for the right moment to be seen again. By late afternoon, the car rolled into Astoria, a small coastal town that looked suspended between time and tide. The air smelled of salt and pine, and gulls wheeled low above the rooftops. Wooden houses climbed the hillside in quiet rows, their paint faded by sea wind and years. Elliot stared out the window as they passed a tiny diner, a bait shop, and an old movie theater, still showing matinees for $5. He wasn't sure whether the place felt quaint or forgotten. Claire pointed toward a sign near the pier. "Riverside Cafe." "That's the spot locals mentioned, sir. Good coffee and quiet corners. You could rest there before your meeting." Elliot considered refusing. He disliked small-town chatter. But the rain had begun again, tapping against the windshield like a patient reminder. 5 minutes, he said. Then we go. The cafe bell jingled as they entered. The smell of roasted beans and cinnamon filled the air, mixing with the faint hiss of the espresso machine. A woman behind the counter greeted them with a warm, unpolished, "Hi there, folks. What can I get you?" Her name tag read Grace. She had steady eyes, the kind of gaze that met you without hesitation. For some reason, it made Elliot uncomfortable. "Black coffee, no sugar," he said, placing his briefcase on the counter. Claire ordered tea and found a table near the window. Grace wrote their order, then hesitated. "Traveling through or staying a while?" "Business," Elliot replied, glancing at his watch. "I don't do vacations." Grace smiled faintly. "Maybe you should. Around here, even the sea takes a break now and then." And her tone was light, but the words caught him off guard. He almost replied, but the sound of a child laughing cut through the cafe. A boy, maybe 8 years old, darted between tables, chasing a paper boat that had fallen from someone's tray. Grace turned and said, "Oliver, careful, sweetheart." The boy stopped, picked up the soggy paper, and grinned. Elliot looked away, yet his heart gave a quick, inexplicable twitch. Grace set the coffee before him. "Here you go." He nodded, took a sip, and froze again. The taste was simple, a little bitter, but familiar. He remembered mornings long ago, a woman humming while pouring the same blend into chipped cups. The memory hit like a wave he hadn't seen coming. He blinked hard, setting the mug down too quickly. Some spilled over, leaving a dark crescent on the napkin. Grace offered another quietly. "Don't worry, happens all the time." He muttered thanks and wiped the table himself, though she was already moving away. Outside, the sky had darkened, turning the river into a sheet of silver-gray glass. He watched rain fall across it in trembling lines, and wondered, again, why this town felt like something unfinished, like a story he'd left unread. Claire checked her watch. "Sir, your appointment's at 6. Elliot rose, leaving a 20 on the counter. Grace noticed. "That's too much for a cup of coffee." "Keep it," he said. She shook her head. "It's too much," she repeated, sliding half back toward him. "We tip fair here, not fancy." For the first time in years, Elliot didn't know what to say. He pocketed the change and gave a curt nod before walking out. The bell jingled again as the door closed behind him, leaving the warm chatter of the cafe fading into the drizzle outside. Back in the car, Claire looked over. "You all right, sir? You seem elsewhere." "I'm fine," he said automatically, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. They drove along the waterfront toward the hotel. The road glistened like wet glass under the streetlights. At a red light, Elliot glanced toward the pier and saw the silhouette of Grace closing up the cafe, the boy skipping beside her with the paper boat now fixed with tape. She bent down, adjusting his hood, and laughed softly. The sight stirred something deep, an ache that felt like both loss and recognition. When the car moved again, he leaned back, eyes closing against the rhythm of the rain. The sound was steady, unrelenting, and yet strangely comforting. He hadn't realized until now how long it had been since he'd heard rain without thinking of deadlines. As they turned the final corner toward the inn, Elliot caught one last glimpse of the water through the fog. The tide was coming in, slow but certain, erasing footprints on the sand. Somewhere deep inside, he sensed that this quiet town, with its coffee and laughter and stubborn honesty, would not let him leave unchanged. And for the first time in decades, Elliot Vance, who never stopped working, wondered what it might feel like to finally stop running. Morning in Astoria came softly, like light filtering through wet curtains. The river shimmered pale blue, and gulls drifted lazily above the docks. Inside the Riverside Cafe, Grace Callahan wiped down the counter, humming to the low tune of an old country song on the radio. The place smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls, and though the rain had eased, droplets still clung to the wide glass windows facing the street. It was her favorite time of day quiet, before the rush, before she had to smile too much or pretend she wasn't tired. Oliver sat at the corner booth, coloring a page from a worn children's book. "Mama, can I draw a big boat today?" Grace smiled. "Sure, sweetheart. Make it big enough for both of us." He looked up with a grin. "And Grandma in heaven?" Her hand stilled over the counter. For a second, the radio filled the silence. Then she nodded, softly. Yes, her too. The bell over the door chimed. She glanced up and saw him, the same man from yesterday. Tall, crisp suit. Eyes that looked like they'd forgotten how to rest. Elliot Vance. He paused at the threshold as if deciding whether to stay or keep walking. Grace felt a flicker of irritation. Big city men never returned to small cafes twice unless they wanted something. She straightened her apron and forced a neutral smile. Back again? She said, keeping her tone light. Elliot looked around before answering. Coffee. Black. Grace picked up the pot and poured, noticing the faint tremor in his hand when he reached for the cup. Rough night? She asked. Long drive, he said simply, then took a slow sip. His eyes flicked toward Oliver. Your boy seems energetic. He's 8, she replied. Energy comes standard. For a moment, their eyes met as guarded. Hers curious but wary. Grace turned away to help another customer. But she could feel his gaze following her. Not in the way of a man flirting, but as if she reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. When she returned to his table, he was looking at the framed photos on the wall, old black and whites of the town decades ago. Fishermen posing with nets, the wooden pier still new. One photo had slipped in among them. A woman laughing beside a coffee truck, holding a cup identical to the ones they still used. Grace's breath caught. That was her mother, Clara. Elliot pointed toward it. She owned this place? Grace nodded, keeping her tone steady. She started it. I took over after she passed. He looked back at the picture. She seems kind. She was. Too kind sometimes. Grace turned before he could ask more. The conversation had drifted too close to old wounds. She went behind the counter, busying her hands, though everything was already spotless. Through the reflection in the glass, she could see him still staring at that photograph, his brow furrowed, lips parted slightly like someone caught between memory and disbelief. When his phone buzzed, he answered quickly. Yes, I'll be there at noon. No delays. His tone was crisp again, professional, shutting out whatever softness had surfaced moments before. He left a tip exactly the right amount this time and walked out into the drizzle. Grace watched him cross the street. Coat collar turned up, briefcase swinging at his side. Something about his gait measured. Heavy made her think of her mother's last words. People carry more regrets than luggage. She turned back to the counter and whispered almost to herself, some folks never learn to put theirs down. Outside, Elliot paused near the car. The fog rolled low over the river, swallowing the edges of the town. He thought of the photo again, the laughter, the sunlight, the way the woman held her cup like a secret. Then he shook it off, telling himself it was coincidence, nothing more. But when he opened his car door, he noticed a small paper left tucked under the wiper, a child's drawing of a big boat, colored bright blue, carrying 3 stick figures holding hands. Written under it, in crooked letters, "Have a safe trip, mister." Elliot stood there in the drizzle, the paper softening in his hand. For reasons he couldn't explain, he folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat pocket. That afternoon, the rain came heavier, sweeping through the harbor and turning the streets into slow-moving ribbons of silver. Elliot spent most of the day in meetings, paperwork, signatures, polite laughter over contracts he no longer cared about. Yet every so often, his thoughts drifted back to that cafe, to the woman with calm eyes and the boy's messy drawing folded inside his coat. When the clock struck 5, he stepped out into the rain without an umbrella. He told Claire to head back to the hotel. I'll walk, he said. She hesitated but nodded. She had learned not to ask questions he didn't want answered. He followed the scent of salt and coffee until the familiar sign of the Riverside Cafe appeared again. Its lights glowed through the mist, a small beacon of warmth against the gray evening. Inside, the tables were half empty, the radio low, playing an old jazz tune that wrapped around the clinking of cups. Grace looked up from behind the counter, surprised but not unfriendly. Didn't expect to see you twice in one day, she said. I needed a place to think, Elliot replied. Seems this town doesn't have many options. She poured him coffee before he asked. Maybe you're just looking in the wrong places. He sat by the window, watching the rain blur the view of the pier. Grace worked in silence, refilling cups, wiping surfaces, occasionally humming to herself. It wasn't until Oliver ran in from the back room, holding a soggy raincoat, that the quiet broke again. Mama, it's leaking in the roof again! Grace sighed, looking up at the ceiling. I'll fix it tomorrow. Elliot stood. Let me take a look. She blinked. You know roofs now? I know how to follow a leak, he said, already dragging a chair beneath the dripping spot. He pressed his palm against the damp wood. You should replace this beam before winter. Water damage spreads fast. Oh. Grace crossed her arms. You sound like someone used to being obeyed. Old habit? She tilted her head. Doesn't seem to make you happy. He looked down at her, surprised by the bluntness. No one talked to him that way, not in years. Happiness isn't something I schedule, he said quietly. Maybe that's the problem. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, thunder rolled far off, deep and steady. The lights flickered, and Oliver shrieked with laughter at the storm. Grace smiled at her son's joy. And something in that smile, a softness, a survival, stirred a feeling in Elliot he couldn't name. When he sat back down, Grace brought him another napkin. You staying in town long? Until the deal's done. And then? He hesitated. Then I leave. That's what everyone says, she murmured. But this town has a way of keeping people who need to stay. Elliot studied her face, the trace of sadness beneath her calm. You sound like someone who knows that from experience. I do, she said simply, then turned to wipe the counter again. Later, when the cafe closed, Grace locked the door and found Oliver asleep in the corner booth, crayons scattered across the table. She gathered them into a small tin and glanced outside. The rain had stopped, but the street still glistened under the lamplight. Through the window, she noticed Elliot standing across the road, hands in his pockets, looking toward the river. He wasn't watching her. He was staring at the water like a man lost in conversation with something he couldn't see. Grace whispered to herself, "Who are you, really?" before turning off the lights. Across the street, Elliot didn't move for a long time. The tide was rising, brushing softly against the pier posts. Somewhere in the dark, a foghorn moaned, low and distant. He took the paper boat drawing from his pocket, now wrinkled but intact, and set it on the river's edge. The water caught it, carrying it gently away into the mist. He watched until it disappeared. Then, for reasons he didn't yet understand, he whispered the name he hadn't said aloud in 30 years. Clara. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a thin veil of mist that drifted through the narrow streets of Astoria. The sky hung pale and quiet, and the smell of wet cedar filled the air. Elliot woke early, long before the alarm, with the strange restlessness that came after sleepless nights. From his hotel window, he could see the Columbia River glimmering under soft light, wide and indifferent, carrying secrets downstream. He buttoned his shirt, hesitated, and glanced at the folder of contracts lying on the desk. The resort project had been delayed again. The local zoning board needed more time. Normally he'd be furious, but this morning he felt oddly grateful for the pause. It gave him an excuse not to leave. He took his coffee to go and walked down toward the harbor. The streets were still damp, lined with parked trucks and flower boxes overflowing with rainwater. At the corner, a sign pointed toward Riverside Cafe. He wasn't sure why his steps led him there. Maybe it was the coffee, or maybe it was something quieter, something that had been tugging at him since yesterday. Grace was outside, wiping down the wooden chairs. She looked up as he approached. You again, she said, smiling despite herself. I heard the coffee here's good, he said dryly. You must have heard wrong, she replied, handing him a towel. Here, make yourself useful if you're going to stand around. He hesitated, then took it. It felt absurd, Elliot Vance, cleaning cafe furniture, but there was something grounding in the simple motion of wiping away the mist. The boards were rough under his hands, the smell of sea and soap mixed in the breeze. Grace worked beside him in easy silence. After a while, she said, You don't strike me as a man who stays in one place long. I don't, he admitted, but this deal's taking its time. Or maybe you're taking yours. He looked at her, puzzled. She only smiled faintly, as if she'd said more than she meant to. The bell over the door rang, and Oliver ran out, carrying a small box of pastries. Mama! I packed them all by myself, he said proudly. That's great, baby, she said. Take one to Mr. Vance. Oliver eyed the stranger, cautious but curious. You look like someone who doesn't eat muffins. Elliot almost laughed. That's surprisingly accurate. Try one anyway, the boy insisted, holding out the box. Elliot took a blueberry muffin, the paper warm against his fingers. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Oliver said, grinning. "Mama says food fixes everything." She's not wrong," Elliot murmured. Grace watched the exchange quietly. There was something in the way Elliot looked at the boy, distant yet soft, as if he were seeing a reflection from long ago. When Oliver ran back inside, humming off-key, Elliot spoke again, his tone quieter. "Your son's got a good heart." "Too much of one, maybe," Grace said. "He takes after his grandmother." Elliot nodded, then glanced toward the framed picture visible through the cafe window. Clara laughing with her coffee cup. "I keep seeing that photo," he said. "Your mother looks familiar somehow." Grace tilted her head. "Maybe she just had one of those faces." "Maybe," he said, though the answer didn't sit right. Something about the curve of Clara's smile, the way her eyes caught light, it stirred something that refused to fade. Grace changed the subject. "You're not from around here, are you?" "Seattle?" he said. "Most of my life." She nodded. "City life. You must miss the noise." "Not really," he said, surprising himself. "Silence has its uses." The cafe opened, and the first few customers came in fishermen, a retired couple, a young woman with a baby. Grace moved easily between them, remembering names, adding sugar without being asked. Elliot sat by the window, watching. She had a way of making strangers feel known, as if each one carried a story she cared to hear. He wondered when he had last known anyone like that. Outside, Oliver was playing with a paper boat again, floating it down a puddle toward the gutter. "Look, Mr. Vance," he called. "It's going to the ocean." Elliot smiled faintly. Everything does, eventually. He didn't realize how true those words sounded until he said them aloud. By late afternoon, the clouds gathered again, heavy and gray. The forecast had promised clear skies, but the Pacific had its own moods. Grace leaned against the counter, wiping her hands on her apron as the radio murmured old tunes from the 70s. The cafe was empty except for Elliot, still at his corner table, lost somewhere in the pages of his notepad, pretending to work though he hadn't written a single word in an hour. Oliver had been quiet for too long. Grace looked toward the back room. "Oliver?" she called. No answer. She checked the restroom, then the kitchen. The small window above the sink stood open, a little stool pushed beneath it. Her heart jumped. Outside, rain began to fall again, fine at first, then sharp as needles. Elliot noticed the change in her face and stood immediately. "What is it?" "It's Oliver," she said, her voice trembling. "He's gone." They rushed outside. The street shimmered with puddles, the wind tugging at the awnings. "He loves the dock," Grace said, running toward the river. "He always goes there to watch the boats." Elliot followed close behind, his shoes splashing through water, his breath quick and uneven. Something inside him stirred a memory of another rainy day, another small hand that had slipped from his grasp years ago. When they reached the pier, the fog had swallowed half the view. "Oliver!" Grace shouted. Her voice cracked, echoing across the empty docks. No answer, only the sound of waves slapping against the wood. Then, faintly, they heard it. A child's voice, calling from below. "Mom, I dropped my boat." Grace ran to the edge. Oliver was crouched on a lower platform near the water, trying to reach a paper boat caught in the current. The tide was rising fast. "Sweetheart, don't move," she cried. "I can't, it's floating away." Before she could react, Elliot was already climbing down the ladder, his expensive coat dark with rain. "Stay back," he told her. The boards groaned under his weight as he reached the boy. Oliver's small fingers were slippery from rain. Elliot grabbed his wrist just as a wave slapped against the dock, soaking them both. "You're all right. I've got you," Elliot said, steady but breathless. The boy clung to him, wide-eyed. "You shouldn't scare your mother like that." "I didn't mean to," Oliver whispered. "I just wanted my boat." Elliot looked down at the crumpled paper, drifting a few feet away. "Some things we can let go," he said softly. "They find their way back in other forms." When they climbed back up, Grace dropped to her knees and pulled her son into her arms, sobbing with relief. Elliot stood nearby, drenched and silent, unsure where to place his hands. For a moment, Grace looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude and something else, a flicker of recognition she couldn't explain. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "You didn't hesitate." He met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, time folded. The rain, the fog, the trembling all blurred into a single, wordless understanding. Then Oliver tugged at his sleeve. "You're a hero, mister." Elliot gave a small, rueful smile. "No, kid. Just someone who was in the right place for once." They walked back together, the storm easing behind them. The cafe lights glowed warm against the gray dusk. Grace handed Elliot a towel and a dry flannel from the lost and found basket. "It's clean," she said. He laughed quietly. "You keep men's clothes here often?" "Just miracles," she said, half smiling. As he changed in the restroom, he caught sight of himself in the mirror, the wrinkles deeper, the eyes tired but not as empty as before. When he stepped out, Grace was pouring coffee, her hands still trembling slightly. "You must be freezing," she said. "I've been colder," he replied, sitting back down. Oliver was curled up on a bench, half asleep, clutching a new paper boat. Grace watched her son for a long time before speaking. "You remind me of someone," she said quietly. "Someone my mother used to talk about." Elliot's chest tightened. "Who?" "A man who used to visit this cafe when I was little. She said he came every Friday. Always alone. Always ordered black coffee. She said he looked like he carried the whole world on his shoulders." Elliot's hand froze over the mug. "What was his name?" "She never told me," Grace said. "Just that he stopped coming one spring, and she never saw him again." Outside, the rain thinned into mist. Elliot stared into his coffee, the steam curling like ghosts of old days. 30 years, Polaroids, letters, a promise left unkept. He swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. Maybe she forgave him." Grace looked at him, puzzled. Forgave who? He forced a faint smile. "Someone who didn't deserve it." She didn't press further. The clock ticked softly. Oliver's breathing grew steady. Grace turned off the radio, letting the silence settle. Elliot stood by the window, watching the river through the glass. The reflection showed the three of them framed together like a family photograph that had waited too long to be taken. Outside, the foghorn moaned again, and the night carried their quiet across the water. The next morning, the town smelled of rain and wood smoke. Sunlight filtered through the clouds in faint ribbons, glinting off puddles that mirrored the sky. The storm had passed, but it had left a tenderness behind the kind that makes people talk softer, move slower. Grace stood outside the cafe, hanging a small open sign while Oliver drew chalk boats on the sidewalk. Inside, the tables gleamed from fresh polish, and the sound of dishes clinking carried a quiet rhythm of routine. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, normal. Then Elliot walked in. He wasn't wearing his suit today. A flannel shirt, jeans, and a worn leather jacket had replaced his corporate armor. Grace looked up in mild surprise. "Didn't recognize you without the tie." He smiled faintly. "Didn't feel like hiding behind one today." Oliver looked up from his drawing. "Hey, it's the boat rescuer," he said proudly. Elliot chuckled. "That might be my new title." Grace poured coffee, setting the cup before him. "So, you planning to save any more paper boats today?" "Not if I can help it," he replied, though his eyes softened at the memory. For a while, they spoke little. Grace refilled sugar jars. Elliot stared out at the river. The silence between them was easy, the kind that didn't need filling. But underneath, both carried questions they weren't ready to ask. Finally, Grace broke the quiet. "Oliver keeps talking about you," she said. "He thinks you're some kind of secret agent." Elliot smiled. "If I were, I'd be a terrible one. I talk too much." "That's debatable," she said, teasing. Then her voice turned softer. "He doesn't open up to strangers easily. I think he senses something familiar about you." The words landed heavier than she intended. Elliot set down his cup. "Familiar?" She nodded. "Children have good instincts." He looked down, rubbing his thumb along the rim of the mug. "Familiar." The word lingered. How could a boy he just met feel like someone he'd known all his life? He told himself it was just resemblance, some echo of Clara's kindness in both their faces, but deep down, a quiet unease began to stir. A group of regulars entered then, breaking the moment. Grace greeted them with her usual warmth, but Elliot could see the way she carried herself, strong, self-contained, the kind of woman who'd learned to rely on no one. It reminded him of Clara in her younger days, the woman who'd once told him, "People leave too easily. Elliot, don't be one of them." He had left anyway. When the morning rush ended, Grace joined him by the window, wiping her hands on a towel. "You said yesterday you're from Seattle," she said casually. "Did you ever spend time around here before?" He hesitated. "Once. A long time ago." She looked at him, curious. "Vacation?" "No," he said quietly. "Work. I came here on a business trip, must have been 30 years ago. Your cafe wasn't here then, but there was a little coffee truck by the pier." Grace froze. "My mother's truck," she whispered. Elliot's gaze met hers. In that instant, time folded. He could see it again, the young woman with wind in her hair, laughing as she poured coffee from a silver thermos, teasing him for tipping too much. Clara. She'd remembered him enough to tell her daughter stories. He swallowed hard. She had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen. Grace's throat tightened. "You knew her?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, not for long, but enough to remember." Silence settled like dust between them. Grace looked away, blinking fast. "She passed away 8 years ago." "I'm sorry," he said softly. She deserved more time. Oliver came running up, breaking the heaviness. "Mama, look, my boat's got a name now." He showed them his chalk, drawing on the sidewalk. In crooked letters, he'd written the Clara. Grace smiled, her eyes glistening. Elliot stared at the name, his breath catching in his chest. The universe had a strange way of circling back always to the same river, the same faces, the same debts left unpaid. He whispered under his breath, "You still find ways to speak, don't you, Clara?" Grace turned to him. "What did you say?" He shook his head gently. "Nothing. Just, she'd be proud of you." For the first time, Grace didn't have a ready answer. She just nodded, fighting the lump in her throat, and looked back toward the river. The tide was rising again. That night, Elliot couldn't sleep. The hotel room felt colder than usual, its silence pressing against his chest. He sat by the window, a cup of untouched coffee beside him, and stared at the dark curve of the Columbia River beyond the glass. Streetlights shimmered on the water like broken coins. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn moaned long, lonely, fading into the night. He opened his old briefcase, not for work, but for the small leather notebook hidden beneath the papers. Its corners were worn smooth, the pages filled with notes and names, deals long closed, promises long forgotten. But between two blank sheets lay a faded photograph. Clara, standing by her coffee truck, the same laughter frozen in time. On the back, her handwriting still faintly visible. "For Elliot, wherever you end up, may kindness find you first." He traced the words with his thumb. "You found me, Clara," he whispered. "Just 30 years too late." The next morning, he returned to the cafe before sunrise. Grace was already there, setting up chairs while Oliver still slept in the back. The smell of brewing coffee filled the small space, grounding the world again. She looked up, surprised to see him so early. "Couldn't sleep," he said simply. "Me neither," she admitted. "Too much thinking." They stood in quiet for a moment before Elliot spoke again. "Your mother, she helped me once, when I didn't deserve it." Grace tilted her head. "Help you how?" "She made me see people again," he said, eyes distant. "I was younger than arrogant, certain I could buy whatever I wanted, fix anything with money. But one night, she told me something I've never forgotten." "What did she say?" He smiled faintly. "She said, 'Money can't buy peace, Elliot. You only get that when you stop running from what you broke.'" Grace studied him carefully, sensing the weight beneath his words. "And what did you break?" He hesitated, his throat tightening. "A promise, one I made to her." Grace's voice softened. "You mean my mother?" He nodded slowly. "Yes. I told her I'd come back. I never did." For a long time, Grace said nothing. The only sound was the steady drip of the coffee pot. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "You were that man she used to talk about." "I suppose I was," he said, "and I suppose I'm not proud of it." Tears welled in her eyes, not out of anger, but recognition. The man standing before her wasn't the arrogant businessman she'd first met, but someone stripped bare by regret. "She forgave you, you know," Grace said quietly. She always said some people leave not because they stop caring, but because they don't know how to stay. Elliot closed his eyes, his hand shaking slightly. I didn't think she'd remember me at all. She did, Grace said. Every Friday, she brewed an extra cup of coffee and left it on the counter. Said it was for a man who might find his way back one day. A silence fell between them, so deep it almost felt sacred. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the windows, soft and golden. Oliver stirred awake then, rubbing his eyes, his hair a wild halo. "Mr. Vance?" he said sleepily. "You're here again." Elliot crouched beside him. "Yeah, kiddo. Guess I can't stay away." Oliver smiled. "Mama says when people keep coming back, it's 'cause their hearts forget how to leave." Grace chuckled through her tears. "He listens too much." "He's right," Elliot said softly. He stood, pulling a small envelope from his jacket. "I wasn't sure if I should give you this," he said, handing it to Grace. Inside was the old photograph of Clara, carefully restored and reprinted, with a note written in Elliot's trembling handwriting. "For Grace, the best part of your mother still lives in you." And this. Grace held the picture close, her fingers brushing the edge as if afraid it might vanish. "Thank you," she whispered. Elliot looked toward the river outside the window. The sunlight danced on the water, breaking into thousands of tiny reflections. "She used to say the river carries everything we can't keep," he murmured. Maybe she was right, but sometimes it brings a few things back. Grace followed his gaze, then smiled through quiet tears. Maybe it just took the long way around. As Oliver began setting tiny paper boats along the counter. One by one, Elliot watched him carefully, the boy's concentration, his small hands folding creases with care. A strange peace filled his chest, the kind he hadn't known since his youth. Grace looked at him then, something shifting gently in her eyes. "You could stay for breakfast," she said softly. "We make good pancakes when we try." He hesitated. "I wouldn't want to intrude." "It's not intruding," she said. "It's catching up just a few decades late." Elliot smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. "All right then," he said. "Let's start with coffee." Grace poured, the steam curling upward, carrying the faint scent of cinnamon and forgiveness. The morning light touched all three of them, the woman, the man, the child, framed together in that small cafe where old promises found their way home. The following week drifted by with a gentleness that felt almost unfamiliar to Elliot. The river moved slower, the mornings quieter. For once, he found himself waking not to the shrill call of business alarms, but to the faint smell of coffee and the sound of laughter seeping from the riverside cafe. He'd begun stopping by each morning, not for work, not even for coffee, but because being there seemed to steady something inside him. Grace had noticed. "You've officially become a regular," she teased as she handed him his cup one morning. "That's dangerous. You'll start expecting free refills for life." He smiled. "I think I already got more than that." Oliver, sitting on the counter swinging his legs, grinned. "You mean pancakes?" "Especially pancakes," Elliot said. The cafe had become a small ritual for him, a pause between two versions of himself. His phone still buzzed with calls from Seattle shareholders, meetings, numbers, but he began ignoring them. Every time he glanced at Grace and Oliver, laughter filling the tiny room, those numbers lost their meaning. One afternoon, Grace found him sitting by the window long after closing time. The rain had started again, tapping softly on the glass. He was staring at the old photo of Clara that now hung near the register. She'd placed it there after he returned it, framed in dark oak. "She'd like this spot," Grace said, pulling up a chair beside him. "She'd like what you've built," he replied. "There's peace here." Grace smiled faintly. "Peace takes work." "Then you're good at it." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the rain deepened and the soft hiss filled the space between their words. Grace finally spoke. "You said you came back because of business. Is that still true?" Elliot took a breath. "It was, at first. My company wanted to buy this property, turn it into part of the resort chain I manage." Her expression didn't change, but her voice cooled. "So you were here to take our cafe?" "I was," he admitted quietly. "But I stopped the deal." "Why?" He looked at her, meeting her gaze. "Because some things aren't meant to be bought. This place, it's more alive than anything I've ever built, and maybe for once, I wanted to stop breaking what's still whole." Grace exhaled slowly, her anger softening. You could have just said that. I didn't know how. He smiled faintly. I'm still learning. Oh? Oliver came running in from the back with a paper boat painted in bright blue. Look, Mama! I named it the Second Chance! Grace laughed. That's a big name for a little boat. Elliot knelt to look at it. That's a good name, he said softly. Maybe the best one there is. The boy placed it carefully on the counter, proud and serious. Boats are for people who don't want to stay stuck, he said, repeating something Grace must have told him. Elliot looked up at Grace. Wise kid. Oh? She gets it from my mother, she said with a small smile. The storm outside grew louder, thunder rolling far off. The cafe lights flickered briefly, and Grace lit a small candle on the counter. Its flame wavered, golden and warm. For a long time, none of them spoke. Elliot watched the candlelight dance across their faces, the mother's calm, the child's wonder, and felt something fragile and unfamiliar bloom inside his chest. When Grace finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. You don't have to keep coming here, you know. We'll be fine. I know, he said, but I want to. There was no reply, just a quiet nod. Outside, the storm softened to a steady drizzle, and the cafe felt like the only light in town. Elliot stayed until closing, helping stack chairs and wipe tables. It felt absurd, a man used to boardrooms now sweeping floors, but it was the most honest work he'd done in years. As they locked the doors for the night, Grace turned to him. You don't have to fix everything, Elliot. He smiled gently. Maybe not, but I'd like to start with what I can. The next few days brought a steady rhythm of small miracles. Elliot, once the man who never stayed in one place long enough to see a sunrise twice, began showing up at the cafe before the doors even opened. He'd roll up his sleeves, carry boxes, fix the squeaky hinges on the pantry door, and change the flickering bulbs above the counter. Grace tried to protest at first. You don't have to do all that, she said. I know, he replied, tightening a bolt under the sink. That's why I want to. It wasn't grand gestures that began to change things, it was the quiet ones. The way Elliot wiped Oliver's chalk drawings off the sidewalk after closing, so the boy could start fresh each morning. The way he always brewed the first pot of coffee for Grace, leaving her favorite mug by the register before she arrived. He never said much about it, and she never thanked him out loud. But something unspoken grew between them, a peace made from shared silences and small kindnesses. One afternoon, when the river shimmered like glass and the air smelled of rain yet to fall, Grace found him standing by the old picture of her mother. You look like a man asking for permission, she said softly. Maybe I am, he murmured. For what? To start again. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes lingered on the photograph, Clara smiling under the morning light, her hands wrapped around a paper cup. Starting over isn't about forgetting what you did, Grace said finally. It's about choosing to do something better because of it. He nodded. Then that's what I'm trying to do. Oliver came bounding in, cheeks red from running. Mr. Vance, come see! He tugged at Elliot's sleeve and led him outside. Behind the cafe, in the narrow alley by the riverbank, the boy had built a small wooden box out of driftwood scraps and old nails. Inside it, a handful of paper boats were lined up neatly. On the lid, he'd written in marker, The Second Chance Fleet. Elliot crouched beside him, speechless. You built this? Yeah, Oliver said proudly. Mama said you helped fix things, so I made a place for boats that need fixing too. Elliot's throat tightened. That's pretty incredible. Grace appeared at the doorway, smiling softly as the boy launched one of his boats into the river. He's been saving them all week, she said. Elliot watched the tiny vessel float away, carried by the current. He's got your mother's heart, he said quietly. Maybe he's got both of yours, Grace replied before she realized the weight of what she'd said. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind lifted a few strands of Grace's hair, and Elliot had to look away before his emotions betrayed him. There was something about this town, this river, this small cafe. It stripped him of every mask he'd worn for years. That evening, Grace closed early. They sat on the porch, mugs in hand, watching the sunset melt into the water. The air was cool and sweet, and fireflies began to shimmer above the grass. You ever think about leaving again? Grace asked quietly. I used to think leaving was the only thing I was good at, he said. Now I'm not so sure. You don't have to have an answer tonight, she said. Just don't disappear without saying goodbye." He smiled faintly. "I don't plan to disappear anymore." Oliver came out, wrapped in a small blanket, half asleep. Grace pulled him into her lap, and Elliot watched the boy nestle against her shoulder. Something inside him ached, not with regret this time, but with longing for the years he'd lost, running from his own heart. He turned his gaze toward the horizon. "When I first came here," he said slowly, "I thought I was just finishing a deal. But now, every time I walk into this cafe, it feels like I'm walking into a promise I never kept." Grace looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Then maybe it's time to rewrite it." The words lingered between them, soft and sure, like the glow of the last sunlight before night. Later, after she'd carried Oliver inside, Elliot stayed on the porch alone. The night had grown still. The river whispered below, carrying the reflections of stars like tiny lanterns. He took out an old business card and turned it over. On the blank side, he wrote in neat, deliberate strokes, "To the ones I hurt, and to the ones who forgave me, I'll spend the rest of my life earning it. Ember 4. He folded the card and set it beneath the small candle on the porch railing. The flame flickered, caught the edge of the paper, and burned it slowly until it curled into ash. Elliot watched it drift away into the night, feeling lighter than he had in decades. Inside, Grace's laughter carried softly through the open window, the sound of a home he never thought he'd find again. And for the first time in 30 years, Elliot didn't think about where he was going next, only where he was and who was waiting there. The first chill of autumn had arrived in Astoria. The mornings were cloaked in fog, and the river wore a silvery coat that seemed to blur the line between water and sky. The air smelled of pine and sea salt, and the old ferry's horn echoed faintly across town like a memory that refused to fade. Inside the Riverside Cafe, the warmth was steady. The bell over the door rang softly as locals came in for their usual coffee and pie. Grace moved with her quiet rhythm, greeting names, refilling mugs, laughing in the way that made people linger longer than they planned. Elliot sat at his usual table near the window, papers spread before him. Though he wasn't reading them, he was thinking. Business had started calling again. Emails, phone messages, even a personal visit from his assistant, Claire. She had shown up unannounced, her heels clicking sharply on the wooden floor of the cafe. "Mr. Vance," she said, lowering her voice. "You're needed in Seattle. The board's growing restless. You've missed 2 meetings." Elliot stirred his coffee without looking up. "They'll manage." "With respect, sir," Claire said, glancing at Grace behind the counter. "They don't think you will." Grace pretended not to listen, but she could feel the tension in the air. Oliver, sitting on a stool, sensed it too and grew quiet. Elliot sighed. "Tell them I'll call in next week." You said that last week," Claire replied, her voice softened. "Sir, you built that company from nothing. Are you really ready to walk away?" He looked out the window toward the river, the current slow and sure. "Maybe walking away isn't the same as giving up," he said. Claire followed his gaze, then exhaled. "This town's changed you." Elliot smiled faintly. "Maybe it reminded me who I was before I forgot." When she left, Grace approached his table, wiping her hands on her apron. "That sounded serious," she said. "It was," he admitted. "Are you going back?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "Part of me still belongs there. But another part—" His eyes moved to Oliver, who was folding a new paper boat. "Another part's learning to breathe here." Grace nodded slowly. "Maybe it's not about where you belong, but who you belong to." Her words lingered long after she returned to the counter. Elliot sat there, staring at the faint reflection of himself in the cafe window. He looked older, yes, but also more alive, like a man finally stepping into the truth he'd run from. That evening, as the cafe emptied, Grace found him cleaning up without being asked. "You don't have to do that," she said. He smiled. "You've said that before, and you never listen. I guess I'm a slow learner." They shared a laugh that faded into quiet. Grace leaned on the counter, looking out at the streetlights shimmering through the mist. "Sometimes I worry about tomorrow," she said softly. "About keeping this place going, about Oliver's school, the bills. Some nights it feels heavier than I can handle." Elliot nodded, understanding too well. "The weight of tomorrow," he murmured. "I used to carry that every day. But I've learned something. Tomorrow doesn't always need us to be strong. Sometimes it just needs us to show up." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. That's easier said than done. Then let me help, he said. Grace hesitated, torn between pride and gratitude. You've already done enough. He shook his head gently. Not yet. The cafe lights dimmed, and the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. For a moment, the world felt suspended. Two people standing at the edge of something fragile but real. Elliot took a slow breath. Grace, if I could rewrite everything, I would start by never leaving this town all those years ago. She looked at him with quiet understanding. Maybe you had to leave to find your way back. Outside, the fog pressed close to the windows. Inside, the warmth between them grew steady, like a promise too shy to speak its name. The following week, a letter arrived, not in an email, not typed, but printed on company stationery and sealed with the sharp edge of formality. Grace found it tucked under the cafe door early one morning. The words were polite, distant, and devastating. Notice of purchase intent. The Riverside property has been placed under corporate acquisition review. Please prepare for transition within 60 days. Her hands trembled as she read. The letterhead bore the logo of Vance Hospitality Group. By the time Elliot arrived, she was standing behind the counter, the letter folded tightly in her hand. You said you stopped the deal, she whispered, her voice brittle. I did, he said quickly. I swear I did. Then why am I holding this? He took the paper, scanning it, his expression darkening. This wasn't supposed to happen. The board must have pushed it through without me. Grace's eyes filled with hurt. You're their chairman, aren't you? You built this company. I did, he said softly. And now it's trying to undo the only good thing I've found in years. Oliver peeked from the doorway, sensing the tension. Mama? Grace forced a smile for him. It's all right, sweetheart. Go to the back, okay? When the boy was gone, her composure broke. Do you know what this cafe means to me? To this town? To my mother? I know, he said, voice low. That's why I'll fix it. Can you? She asked bitterly. Or is this another promise you'll leave behind? The words struck deep. Elliot didn't answer. He just looked down at the letter again, his reflection warped in the glossy ink. For the first time in decades, he felt powerless, not as a businessman, but as a man. That night, he returned to his hotel and made call after call, his voice calm but his hands shaking. Reverse the acquisition, he ordered. Pull every document tied to the Riverside property. Impossible, the board chair said. Contracts are signed. Investors are in. Then buy it out, Elliot snapped. Sell my shares if you have to. There was silence on the line. You'd lose your seat, came the reply. Then I'll stand, he said quietly, and hung up. The next morning, he arrived at the cafe, looking exhausted, a faint tremor in his right hand. Grace was sweeping near the doorway, not meeting his eyes. You don't owe me explanations, she said. Maybe not, he replied, but I owe you the truth. He laid a set of documents on the counter notarized, signed. I liquidated my shares last night. The cafe's deed is yours now, free and clear. The company can't touch it again. Grace stared, speechless. What did you do? I gave up what I built, he said simply. It was time. Her lips trembled. Why would you do that? He smiled faintly. Because I broke enough promises already. This one, I wanted to keep. The air went still. The hum of the coffee machine seemed to fade. Grace reached out slowly, touching the edge of the papers as though afraid they might vanish. You didn't have to. I did, he interrupted gently. You once said peace takes work. I'm finally willing to work for it. Tears glistened in her eyes. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but no words felt right. Instead, she simply nodded. My mother would have liked you better this time, she said softly. Then I must be doing something right, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Oliver ran in then, holding a small paper boat painted gold. I made this one special, he said proudly. It's called the Tomorrow. Elliot crouched to eye level with him. That's a good name. What's it for? Oliver grinned. For when you want to start over, but you're scared you'll mess up again. Grace smiled through tears. Sounds like a good boat for grown-ups too. Outside, the rain began to fall again. Not heavy this time, but gentle, rhythmic, cleansing. Elliot watched the drops race down the window and thought of how easily the past could wash away if you just stopped holding it tight. He turned to Grace. I think I might stay a while longer, if you'll have me." She looked at him, her expression soft but steady. "Elliot, you already are." He nodded, silent gratitude in his eyes. Later that evening, as they closed up, the last customers gone, Grace lit a candle near the window, an old habit her mother had kept for good luck. The golden light flickered across their faces. Oliver, half asleep in the booth, murmured, "Don't blow it out, Mama. It's for tomorrow." Grace smiled. "Then we'll keep it burning." Elliot looked at the small flame, then at the woman and child beside him, the family he never thought he deserved. And for the first time in a lifetime of chasing everything that didn't matter, he realized that redemption wasn't something you earned, it was something you shared. The candlelight shimmered against the window pane, glowing like the faint promise of dawn, fragile, flickering, but still holding on. Winter came quietly to Astoria. The mornings were slower now, the river wearing a coat of fog that refused to lift until noon. The trees along the water had lost most of their leaves, and the air carried that faint scent of wood smoke and salt that always made the town feel older than it was. The Riverside Cafe looked different, too brighter somehow. Elliot had helped repaint the window frames, a soft cream color, and Grace had hung new curtains patterned with tiny golden leaves. The chalkboard menu, once plain, now had Oliver's doodles on every corner, boats, stars, and a stick figure family holding hands. "People keep asking if we've been bought by an artist," Grace said one morning, watching Oliver's new sketches on the door. Elliot laughed. "Tell them it's a partnership, with an 8-year-old. The best kind," he said, sipping his coffee. It had been nearly 2 months since the storm of the company's acquisition notice. Since then, the town had started to notice the change in Elliot. He wasn't Mr. Vance anymore, not the businessman, not the outsider. No, he was simply Elliot, the man who fixed the old church bench, shoveled snow from the community steps, and always tipped too much at the diner. Some evenings, he'd sit by the river with Oliver, both of them bundled in thick coats, watching the paper boats float under the streetlights. "You think they ever make it to the ocean?" Oliver would ask. "Maybe," Elliot would say. "Or maybe they just circle back when they miss home." Grace would watch from the cafe window, her heart warming at the sight. It was strange the man who once brought chaos into her world had somehow become the calm at the center of it. One afternoon, as snow began to fall in lazy flakes, Grace found Elliot in the back room, repairing a loose table leg. "You know," she said, leaning on the doorway, "you've done half the maintenance in this place. I should probably put you on payroll." He looked up, smiling. "You couldn't afford me." "Maybe I could, if you worked for tips and coffee." He chuckled. "Best offer I've had in years." There was a pause, the kind of quiet that felt full, not empty. Grace studied him for a moment. "You seem lighter lately," she said softly. "Maybe I am," he replied. "When you spend years running, standing still feels like grace." She smiled at the word. "Grace? Huh?" He looked up at her, meeting her eyes. "The best kind." For a moment, neither looked away. The sound of Oliver humming softly in the next room filled the space between them, the sound of ordinary life, simple and healing. That night, the cafe hosted a small winter gathering, something Grace's mother used to do every December. Locals brought pies, candles, and old songs. Elliot helped string lights around the windows, his hands clumsy but determined. Oliver ran around with his friends, laughing so loudly that even the oldest regulars couldn't help but smile. As the evening deepened, Grace stepped up to speak. Her voice trembled slightly. "My mother used to say this cafe wasn't just for food. It was for keeping people warm, not just their hands, but their hearts. So, thank you all for helping keep that warmth alive." She paused, glancing toward Elliot, who stood at the back of the room. Their eyes met, and he gave a small nod, a silent promise that he was there, and he wasn't leaving. When the crowd began singing an old Christmas hymn, Elliot closed his eyes. The soft voices, the candlelight flickering on the walls, it all felt like coming home after a very long winter. And as Grace's voice carried gently above the others, something inside him settled completely. The weight he'd carried for so many years of guilt, of loss, of things left unsaid began to melt away, leaving only peace and light in its place. When the last guests had gone and the cafe was quiet again, the snow outside had grown thicker, blanketing the streets in white. The only sounds were the hum of the heater and the soft ticking of the old clock above the counter. Grace stood by the window, watching the snowflakes drift down through the streetlight glow. Elliot came over, still holding one of the candles from the tables. Its flame flickered gently as he set it beside her. "Your mother would have loved tonight," he said. Grace smiled faintly. "She used to say winners for remembering." He nodded. "And forgiving." They stood there in silence, watching the light shimmer across the glass. Oliver had fallen asleep in one of the booths, a blanket pulled over him. His small paper boat, the Tomorrow, rested beside his hand like a guardian. Grace turned to Elliot. "You've changed this place," she said quietly. "And not just the walls or the paint. You've changed how it feels to walk in." He looked at her, his voice low. "I think this place changed me first." She tilted her head. "How so?" "I used to think redemption was something you bought," he said. "A deal you made to feel less guilty. But it isn't, is it? It's in moments like this when you stop asking to be forgiven and start living like you already are." Her eyes softened. "You sound like someone my mother would have trusted." "I'm trying to earn that," he said. "For a long time." They said nothing more. Grace reached up and adjusted the candle wick, watching the flame grow steadier. The golden glow brushed across their faces, blurring the lines of age, softening everything that had been hard between them. Elliot's gaze drifted to the photograph of Clara on the wall, her smile eternal, her eyes bright even in the faded print. "You know," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I think she knew this would happen someday." Grace followed his eyes. "Knew what?" "That I'd need a reason to come back," he murmured. Grace felt her throat tighten. "And did you find it?" He turned to her, meeting her gaze fully. "I did. 2 of them, actually." Her breath caught just a small, quiet sound. But it said everything. The cafe lights dimmed automatically then, as they always did after midnight. Only the candles remained, their glow soft and living. Elliot moved to lock the door, then returned to stand beside her once more. "You're staying then?" Grace asked. "If you'll let me," he said. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like, but I'd like to find out from here." She smiled, that gentle, tired smile that carried the weight of years and the tenderness of forgiveness. "Tomorrow looks like pancakes at 8, she said. He chuckled softly. "Then I'll be here at 7:30. They both laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that feels like breathing again after holding your breath for too long. Grace turned toward the sleeping boy, her voice lowering. "He likes you, you know." Elliot looked at Oliver and nodded. "The feeling's mutual. He said you remind him of the stories my mother used to tell about the man who helped her once by the river." Elliot's eyes glistened. "She told him that?" "Not directly," Grace said. "But he listens when I talk about her. Somehow, I think he's always known." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and unhurried, each flake catching the lamplight like a quiet blessing. Grace reached for the candle and held it out toward him. "Would you blow it out for us?" He hesitated. "Why me?" "Because," she said gently, "every ending deserves a beginning." Elliot leaned forward and blew softly. The flame wavered, danced once, and went out, leaving only the faint curl of smoke rising between them, like the breath of something being released. For a moment, neither of them moved. The cafe was dark, except for the pale moonlight spilling through the frosted window. Then Grace spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good night, Elliot." He smiled. "Good night, Grace." He turned to leave, but before stepping out, he glanced back one last time. Grace was already covering Oliver with a second blanket, humming the same lullaby Clara once sang, a tune that carried across years, across regrets, across everything he thought was lost. Outside, the snow crunched softly under his boots. He looked up at the glowing cafe sign, Riverside Cafe, and smiled. It no longer felt like a place he visited. It felt like home. Spring came quietly to Astoria, as it always did, without fanfare, without warning, just the slow return of color to a world that had forgotten it could bloom again. The river thawed, sunlight spilled across the docks, and the smell of salt and wet cedar drifted through the town like an old hymn. At the Riverside Cafe, life settled into its new rhythm. The mornings began with laughter and the hiss of the espresso machine. Grace would hum softly while arranging fresh flowers by the window, and Oliver, now taller and bolder, took charge of writing the daily special in chalk, though most days it just said pancakes. And every morning, without fail, Elliot arrived just before the doors opened. He would wipe down tables, warm up the fire, and start the first pot of coffee before Grace had even tied her apron. It had been nearly 6 months since he gave up everything. The company, the city, the noise, and no one in Astoria saw him as a businessman anymore. To them, he was family. One morning, while he was fixing a loose tile near the counter, Grace came up behind him, holding a small envelope.
"This came for you,"
she said.
"from Seattle."
Elliot wiped his hands and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from his old assistant, Claire. The board finalized your retirement honors. They want to name a scholarship after you for small-town students pursuing business ethics. I told them you'd like that. He smiled, folding the letter. Claire always knew how to make things sound noble. Grace leaned on the counter. So, the world still remembers you. He shook his head. Let it. I'm too busy remembering what really matters. She studied him for a moment, the softened lines on his face, the quiet peace in his movements. You look different when you say that, Lynn. He smiled. Because I mean it. Oliver came running in, holding a small wooden box. Look what I found by the river. Inside were a few pebbles and something old. A tarnished silver key. Looks like treasure, Grace said, amused. It's for you, Oliver said to Elliot. You like fixing things. Elliot turned the key over in his hand. You know, he said, your mom told me this river remembers everything we drop into it. Maybe it's giving something back. That evening, as the sun began to set, the cafe closed early. Grace, Elliot, and Oliver walked down to the riverbank. The air was cool and golden, filled with the quiet rhythm of water against wood. Elliot sat on the old bench he had repaired months ago. It faced the wide, shimmering water, the same spot where he had once stood alone, burdened by ghosts. Now, he wasn't alone. Grace handed him a small paper bag. Oliver made something for you, she said. He opened it and found a folded paper boat. Not perfect, not straight, but sturdy. Across its side, in crooked letters, was written, "For the things we can't change, but still love anyway." Elliot swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He's wiser than his years. Grace smiled softly. He gets that from his grandfather. He turned to her sharply, stunned, but she only held his gaze, steady and knowing. I found the old photo, she said quietly. The one of my mother, by the coffee truck. There was a date written on the back, and a note in your handwriting. I don't need you to explain, Elliot. I already know. He stared at her, his hands trembling. You knew all this time? She nodded. Not at first, but I saw how you looked at him, the way you listened to him, the way he somehow made you lighter. A long silence followed. The sound of the river filled it deep, endless, forgiving. I didn't know, Elliot whispered. Your mother never told me. I know, Grace said softly, her voice breaking. And I think she did too. Maybe she wanted to protect us both. He covered his face, breathing unevenly. All those years, I thought my mistakes were final, and then I met him, my grandson, without even knowing. Grace reached over and placed her hand over his. Sometimes life gives us back what we lost, just in a different shape. Elliot looked out at the river, tears glinting in his eyes. The river remembers, he murmured. It carries what we leave behind and brings it home when we're ready. Grace smiled through her own tears. Then maybe it remembered you. The three of them sat there as the sky turned amber, the waves carrying faint reflections of light. Oliver began humming softly, folding another small boat. Elliot watched him, his chest aching with gratitude, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that humbles. When Oliver handed him the new boat, Elliot smiled. What's this one called? Oliver grinned. The Homecoming. The next morning broke soft and golden, the kind of morning that felt like a blessing whispered rather than spoken. Mist still clung to the water, and the faint cry of gulls echoed over the river. Elliot stood outside the cafe before sunrise, a cup of steaming coffee in his hands. Across the glass, he could see Grace and Oliver setting up for the day, laughter and motion framed by the warmth of the light. He stayed there for a while, just watching. There was something almost sacred about ordinary moments when you'd nearly lost the chance to have them. Grace noticed him and opened the door. You're up early, she said, smiling. Old habits, he replied. Couldn't sleep. Too much peace, maybe. She chuckled softly. That's a good problem to have. Inside, the cafe smelled of cinnamon and maple syrup. Oliver was at the counter, wearing an apron 2 sizes too big, proudly flipping pancakes under Grace's watchful eye. I'm practicing for when I'm big, he announced. Big enough to run the place someday, Elliot said. Or to build one just like it, Oliver added. Only bigger, Elliot smiled. Then you'll need a name for it. Oliver thought for a moment, tapping the spatula against his chin. Maybe the river remembers, like your story. Elliot froze for a heartbeat, then nodded slowly. That's a perfect name. Later that afternoon, the 3 of them walked back to the riverbank, the same spot where truth had finally come home. The spring sun warmed their faces, and the current shimmered in the light. Oliver carried 2 small paper boats, the Homecoming and the Tomorrow. Ready? He asked. Ready, Grace said, kneeling beside him. They set the boats down together, letting the current catch them. The small sails quivered for a moment before gliding smoothly downstream. Elliot watched, his heart full. You know, Grace said softly, when I was little, my mother told me rivers carry messages if you listen long enough. What do you think this one's saying? Elliot asked. She smiled. That some promises are kept late, but they're still kept. They sat in the grass for a while after that, not speaking. The sun dipped low, turning the river to gold. Birds skimmed the surface, and the scent of pine drifted from the far shore. Elliot looked at Grace and Oliver, his daughter and grandson, and felt the sharp, tender ache of gratitude that comes when a story you thought was over begins again. Grace turned toward him. You know, you could have left after everything. Most people would have. I did leave once, he said quietly, and I learned what it cost. This time, I'm staying. Even without the company? The board? The city? He smiled. None of them ever called me family. Oliver leaned against his shoulder, sleepy and content. Grandpa, he mumbled, do you think the river remembers my boats? Elliot looked out at the fading ripples. I think it remembers everything that matters. The evening wind lifted, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and wildflowers. Grace rested her head lightly on Elliot's arm, and for a long time, the 3 of them sat in silence, the way people do when words would only get in the way. As the sun touched the horizon, Elliot reached into his pocket and pulled out the old silver key Oliver had found weeks ago. He held it up, its metal catching the light. You know, he said softly, I think this belongs here. He placed the key gently on a smooth stone by the water's edge, a quiet offering to the past. For what was locked, he murmured, and for what's been opened again. Grace squeezed his hand. She'd be proud of you. He smiled faintly. Maybe she's the one who sent me back. The river whispered below them, a low, endless murmur that sounded almost like agreement. As the last light faded, Grace stood and brushed off her jeans. Come on, she said. Pancakes are waiting. Elliot rose slowly, taking one last look at the water. The boats had already drifted out of sight, but he didn't feel lost this time. Only peace. When they turned back toward town, the cafe's windows glowed softly against the twilight. From a distance, it looked almost like a lighthouse, steady, warm, and unafraid of the dark. And as Elliot closed the door behind them that night, the bell above the entrance chimed once a small, familiar sound that felt like the heartbeat of a home finally found. He glanced at Grace and Oliver, their laughter filling the little room. Then he whispered to himself, just loud enough for the river outside to hear, Thank you for remembering, M. The river kept flowing long after their story ended. Its steady current carried the memories of every sunrise and every second chance that had quietly unfolded beside it. If you listen closely, you might still hear the laughter of a boy, the hum of a woman closing her cafe for the night, and the soft voice of a man who finally learned that coming home isn't about a place, it's about a feeling. Elliot's redemption wasn't found in grand gestures or wealth, but in the small, ordinary moments. He once took for granted the warmth of a shared breakfast, the sound of rain against the window, the comfort of being called Grandpa. Grace found peace not by forgetting the past, but by opening her heart wide enough to let it sit beside forgiveness. And little Oliver, with his paper boats and bright imagination, reminded them both that hope has a way of finding its way downstream, no matter how far it drifts. In the end, they didn't rewrite their past. They simply lived it better the second time around. The cafe became a place of quiet miracles where people stopped not just for coffee, but to remember what kindness feels like. And each morning, when sunlight touched the river and the bell over the cafe door rang, it was as if life itself whispered, "You've made it home." Listen. Love, when given freely, can rebuild what time has broken. Redemption isn't something you earn, it's something you live through every act of care, every moment you choose connection over pride. Like the steady light of a porch lamp that never goes out, kindness can guide even the loneliest traveler back to where they belong. Maybe that's what life is teaching us, especially as we grow older, that no success, no fortune, no applause can ever replace the warmth of a hand that forgives or the sound of someone calling your name at the dinner table. The richest memories are never made in boardrooms or crowded streets, but around kitchen tables, where the smell of coffee and laughter lingers long after the cups are empty. And so, as the story fades into its final echo, the lesson remains clear. Happiness doesn't come from what we hold on to, but from what we're willing to set free. Like the river that carried their paper boats, our lives move forward, sometimes slow, sometimes uncertain, but always toward light, always toward home. If this story touched your heart, dear listener, take a moment to breathe and reflect. Think about the people who once drifted away from your life. Maybe it's time to let the river carry forgiveness their way. And if you felt something, even a small warmth in your chest, leave a 1-inch the comments to let us know this story reached you. If it didn't, or if you have thoughts to share, type 0 and tell us what you'd like to see next. Because stories, much like rivers, are meant to keep flowing, carrying our lessons, our memories, and our love to those still searching for a way home.